Hey folks, so I'm here once again with Danny Shaw, the academic, activist, professor, anti-imperialist, revolutionary organizer, etc. And Danny Shaw just recently visited Haiti. And so he has quite a lot to report about what went on in the country. The class struggle among the Haitian people is certainly intensifying. Danny, can you just break down for us what is going on in the country? What is the current situation there? And then we can get into the broader understanding of history. But what's the current crisis?
Yeah, right now, Jovenel Moïse, the Tissu Blanc, or the dictator of, sponsored by the U.S. and the Organization of American States, who've given him this international approval, rubber-stamped him, his constitutional mandate, according to the 1987 Constitution and different articles in that Constitution, his mandate finished as of February 7th. So there's been a showdown in Haiti with masses and masses of people saying this is not our president. He never represented us to begin with, but any shred of legitimacy that he had still hung on to into the early part of 2021 is gone. So this is what sparked the mass movement. And I saw a complete media blackout, since this wasn't Hong Kong or Tibet or the Uyghur people. Why U.S. imperialism could care less. So I've had a long-standing relationship with the Haitian anti-imperialist forces. So I got down there as quick as I could to participate and try to broadcast, at least to the left in the U.S., the social movements here. I wish I could say the world, but that'd be a bit of an overstatement and misstatement. But to at least get out the truth and to give a platform to these important Haitian social leaders in their struggle against dictatorship and neocolonialism.
Right. Now, it wasn't just U.S. mainstream media that was blacked out. When you tried to live stream from Haiti, Facebook wouldn't allow it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've noticed this this censorship now. Of course, with everything that happened with Trump, it became more of a mainstream story. But so many of us now, for years, because we're activists, revolutionaries, anti-imperialists, if we dare to pay homage to leaders who were cut down, like General Soleimani in Iran or other martyrs across South America and the Caribbean, we've been banned. We've been partially banned. We've been suspended on Facebook. So I'm not sure what set of conditions, and Instagram as well. So far, I've had a little bit more luck with Twitter, but I'm sure they could shut that. They've shut down so many Venezuelan Twitter accounts, Bolivarian Twitter accounts. Anybody that doesn't go along with U.S. unipolarity across the world. So when I was trying to go live with Haitian leaders, it was Facebook and Instagram telling me the same exact thing, because that was really the purpose of my solidarity trip. And as we'll see in this video, we'll try to cut in different clips of the Haitian people in motion. This is a mass movement. Sundays are the climatic days where the social movements come into the streets. This is a national liberation movement. So you have the petty bourgeoisie, you have the workers' organizations, the sweatshop, the syndicat, that's the unions. You have women's organizations, peasant organizations. So it was a wide range of people in the streets. And in the police attitude, whether it was a small student demonstration or a youth-led demonstration or a massive demonstration, these Macoute-like forces, to remember the Tonton Macouts from the 70s and 80s, Papa Doc and Baby Doc's brutal police force, they had a Macoute-like mentality, and they just attacked the marches. They would just show up, and before they even showed up and came to a screeching halt in their trucks, they got the pickup trucks, they would already have launched bullets, tear gas. So the Haitian movement would be on the run. So I was trying to capture all of this, because how can this not be mainstream news in 2021, that in a U.S. neocolony, the police can shoot and kill at will? And that's what we saw again yesterday. I was already back in the United States, but the police attacked yesterday. I was reporting on it from my Twitter. Young activist shot in the leg, his only crime demonstrating against Jovenel Moïse, the dictator.
And why is the United States propping up this illegitimate leader in Haiti? What is the motivation?
The United States has a long, long history in Haiti, going back to the 1915 to 1934 U.S. occupation, where they set the social stage and the military stage for the Duvalier dynasty, which endured about 3.5 decades in Haiti, very similar to what they did in the Dominican Republic with Trujillo and then Balaguer. Same thing in Nicaragua with Somoza. So Haiti has existed as a people, as a nation, trying to defy neocolonialism, first through direct rule, but of course imperialism in 2021 with all of the identity politics, it doesn't look good. Boots on the ground, or openly bombing Syria. They still do it, as we saw last weekend, but it doesn't look as good. So of course imperialism prefers indirect rule. So before Jovenel Moïse, you had Michel Martelly. And before Michel Martelly, you had General Namfi. And before General Namfi, you had Raúl Cedras. So you have this string of puppet leaders connected to the U.S., trained by the U.S. Embassy and U.S. intelligence, working overtime every day, surveilling and patrolling the Haitian mass movement. And anytime there's been Yontil Espoir, some little bit of hope, that's what Jean-Bertrand Aristide represented. Jean-Bertrand Aristide came from the bottom. He came from the People's Church. They called it L'Église, the church from below, or the Forgotten People's Church. His nickname was Tititide, or Small Titide. Jean-Bertrand Aristide set in motion, if you will, or the Haitian people set in motion, the pink tide 13 years before Hugo Chavez won at the polls in Venezuela. So the Haitians, just like 1804, have been at the cutting edge, have been at the vanguard of internationalism, of defying neocolonialism. But every time they've tried to stand up, what does the U.S. do? Economically, militarily, diplomatically, politically. So this is a heavyweight fight. The Haitian leadership understands that. It's important right now that we give them visibility, the importance of translating from Creole to English to Spanish to reach a global audience, to forge this solidarity, because the Haitian leadership is very steadfast. Despite the tear gas and the bullets, there's a massive kidnapping campaign. I can get into some of the more ethnographic observations across Port-au-Prince as well.
Well, can you talk about, it seems that there's more going on here than just a constitutional issue. I mean, it seems like this is a fight very much against austerity and cutbacks and economic policies. Can you talk about that specifically, about what's going on in Haiti in terms of economics?
Yeah, 100%. Everyday reality in Haiti, we always hear this cliche, Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, which I'm so sick of that cliche. It's the most abused, traumatized, oppressed, exploited country in the Western Hemisphere. It's not the poorest. There's incredible mineral resources, agricultural resources. Look at the history of Haiti. 1/5 of all of Haitian land was deforested during the U.S. military occupation. So Haiti has been punished precisely because of its riches, though, of course, after 5 centuries of complete pillage, Haiti was the crown jewel in the French Empire. Of course, the land has been traumatized as well. So a big part of this conversation is reparations. And the only way we could have reparations is if we have a revolution here and in England and in France. But reparations and rebuilding has to be a part of this conversation, because the grinding economic reality in the everyday quartier populaire, the everyday neighborhoods, right now, the Haitian currency, it's 75 goods for $1 US. So the good is not doing well at all. It's never done well under neocolonialism. What currency in an exploited country has ever done well? It's the supremacy of the dollar and the euro. It's white supremacy broadcast onto the world stage through these economic means, right? In terms of electricity, internet, access to television, radio is huge. They call it telejol. You hear something on the radio, then you go tell your neighbor and you turn on the radio together, because for a radio, you can use batteries. You don't need an electrical current. So pagin courant, electricity, like I said, food is very scarce, because you earn in Haitian salaries. The average salary at a Haitian sweatshop on the month, maybe you're making $30, $35. That's for like 50-hour weeks at these so-called, free trade zones. The sweatshop overlords never say sweatshops. They have all these fancy euphemisms. So economic reality is very difficult. Chômage, unemployment is extremely high. Most young people, they're out searching for work, but the reality is there is no work. So Jovenel Moïse gave this presentation, a 20 rambling presentation last week to the United Nations Security Council, and he said that his government, he's always trying to polish things and present himself as this kind of like the Bukele of the Caribbean, if you will, this polished, modern, executive. And he was trying to say that he's implementing all these socio-economic reforms. And it was so displaced from reality, Caleb, that to listen to it. And he got interrupted like 5 times because the internet connection was so bad at the National Palace in Haiti. So if the dictator can't even get good internet, imagine in the everyday neighborhoods. Of course, the Haitians still, quote unquote, have a debt to international finance. How can it be that the most exploited lands, whether it's Mexico's debt or Brazil's debt or Haiti's debt, these are all the contradictions of modern imperialism, but the audacity to say that the people who've been most squeezed and oppressed still have a debt is ridiculous.
Right, and it seems like part of the motivation to remove this dictator is about the impoverishment of the population. He seems to be overseeing kind of the economic demolition of Haitians' working families. Is that correct?
Yeah, the PHTK, the Haitian Bald-Headed Party. I mean, first of all, who calls a serious political party the Bald-Headed Party? That was Michel Martelly because he was bald. And Michel Martelly was this vulgar, almost Andrew Dice Clay. I don't know, the audience might be too young to remember that vulgar comedian character from when I was younger. But Michel Martelly and Jovenel Moïse, these are these mediocre sycophants, yes men, no political talent, no political background, not well versed in Haitian sociology or the Haitian history. So the way the Haitian leadership and the grassroots movement has always broken it down to me is they don't want an intelligent, human rights-esque, kind of like the reformist hand of imperialism. They don't even want that in Haiti because those people actually think and they're critical and they can push back and they don't have just a complete facade. But when you get these absolute clowns, these mediocre types like Martelly and Moïse, their job is to do the bidding. Coca-Cola and Stevia have these massive plantations across Haiti. So that's their job, to act as wrecking balls against the social movements of Haiti. We saw back to back, I'd have to say it 7 or 8 times, UN missions, mission stability missions. That was the fig leaf, the cover that U.S. imperialism was always searching for in Haiti. There's now no UN boots on the ground, but there's an administrative operation. And the Haitian National Police have been trained by the Miami police, by U.S. tax dollars. And that's been a historical relationship that's existed. So I think we have to put this petty, mediocre tyrants in the proper context. And hopefully a lot of diaspora, that's Haitian Americans and Haitians in the diaspora in France and in Canada, can hear this conversation, because if all you hear is MSNBC, if all you hear is CNN, you're not going to come up, to quote Fred Hampton, with answers that answer and solutions that solve. You're going to be completely confused. So a big part of the Haitian diaspora is bought into these sound bites that somehow Jovenel Moïse represents the people, but someone who fires on sight against massive demonstrations, against smaller peaceful demonstrations, clearly is guilty of the worst types of human rights crimes. The kidnapping campaign, there's something called the G9 or the G9. It's not clear. People should check out Haiti Liberty, IT Liberté. Check out Kim Ives and Berthany Dupont and the journalists over there. They do amazing investigative, objective journalism, and they're all over these things. I mean, they're the true experts. The Haitian people are the true experts. I was just happy to be educated more and to try to bring back into different languages this reality. But the gangs, it's not clear exactly who's pulling the strings, who the puppet master is, but from what I could gather on the ground, if you're from a certain neighborhood, Cité Soleil is the most famous bidonville or ghetto in Port-au-Prince, you can't go march freely. If you want to go participate in the anti-dictatorship movement, you're risking your life. You could be kidnapped. If you get labeled as a subversive, the people who run those gangs, who run the infrastructure in that neighborhood, they're going to make a phone call. You can't return to the neighborhood. You could be kidnapped. So there's a lot of that happening around Port-au-Prince. Now, some people could argue that the kidnapping is extra state or paramilitary, or it's escaped even the grasp of the state, because the state, Jovenel Moïse, has also been affected by the kidnapping, because if the economy is not running, that's going to affect even the ruling class.
That seems to be a parallel. We're seeing like Honduras, after the government of Zelaya was overthrown, the actual government that is implementing neoliberalism and austerity is pretty weak, but there is this kind of extra legal campaign of assassinations and kidnappings that kind of keeps the weak neoliberal government in power. There's kind of a shadow state that enforces these policies on behalf of the bankers. Would you say that's a similar situation?
Yeah, I think there is. When entire communities say, they call it pays lock, they're on lockdown, and they can't go join because this is a mass movement. This is a movement against dictatorship. It's a democracy movement. Now, within that democracy movement, you have the revolutionaries, the anti-imperialists. You have all sectors of Haitian society. But I'm glad you brought up the parallel with Honduras and Juan Orlando Hernandez, and of course, Duque in Colombia. These are states run by shadow paramilitary forces who get no headlines in corporate media. So we see this incredible double standard. I mean, can you imagine if in Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua or Iran or in China, peaceful protesters were on site, fired upon? That would be front page news all over, and all these donations going to Hong Kong. So this is really a battle of David versus Goliath. We've set up people-to-people solidarity funding, GoFundMe, so that the real soldiers on the ground can receive these funds, because we want the Haitian people to be their own journalists, that they can broadcast, that they can get out the truth, despite all of the difficulties with internet. In Haiti, the biggest things are Facebook and WhatsApp, because the internet connection is so tough. They don't have the luxuries of the Twitter or the Instagram, or YouTube gets some traction, but WhatsApp is number one. So part of our role in the left here, how can we set up these people-to-people bridges? I'll put in the comments the people-to-people solidarity fundraising, so the money goes right to Molegaf. Molegaf is the movement for fraternity and equality for all Haitians. That's like one on-the-ground anti-war, anti-dictatorship, anti-imperialist force, but there's many groups. So I hope that, on my Twitter, you can go through and see all of the different groups in the leadership. Of course, there's differences in the Haitian left, but there's a united goal against neocolonialism and dictatorship.
I've often pointed to Haiti as an example of what capitalism and neoliberalism has to offer. We always hear stories that, in Venezuela, they have a shortage of toilet paper. That proves that socialism doesn't work. But yet no one looks at Haiti, a country that has been under the control of NAFTA and the free market, and seen a country that is just devastated by these economic policies. No one looks at that and says that's capitalism. But clearly the conditions in Haiti are a great example of capitalism and imperialism in practice, wouldn't you say?
100%. And that's why the Haitian leadership reached out to me. I've had a 23-year relationship with the Haitian left. I learned Haitian Creole because I lived in the Dominican Republic working with the Dominican left, but I saw these apartheid-like conditions, the Dominican police, the Dominican ruling class, how they treated the 1.5 million Haitians who had migrated over the border in search of survival. So there was this anti-Haitianismo, this anti-Haitian hysteria, racism, very similar to how white people, not all white people, but how people from my own family, we've been infected with racism, white supremacy, the worst type of cultural backwardness. So I think that's the parallel to understand. Unfortunately, many Dominicans, not everybody, but that's the way it plays out in the Dominican media. And of course, the Dominican ruling class is the one at fault. So in terms of the everyday reality in Haiti, yeah, things that we would take for granted, simple economic rights. And what imperialism does then, imperialism creates its own narrative. There's no hope for Haiti. Haiti's leaders are always corrupt. So the comrades, when they were building with me, they said, this is, they quoted Fidel Castro, this is the battle of ideas. The battle, we have to win the communicational war. We have to win the informational war. And they knew that through international solidarity, we could reach more people, because when a people have been hit over the head since the time they were little and told, there's no hope for you, your country is destined to be a hellhole. And to quote Donald Trump, right? He used a word even more insulting than hellhole, right? And Donald Trump, in his dark heart, if he has a heart, that's what he truly believes, because he's as brainwashed as anybody, and he's a brainwasher, right? But they've truly convinced us, whether it's the US, whether it's the NGO world. I don't think any country in the world, Caleb, has such a high proportion of non-governmental organizations as Haiti. But as ProPublica revealed, the Red Cross received $500 million post-2010 earthquake to build homes to help Haitians. With that $500 million, they built 6 homes, according to leaked documents from the Red Cross themselves to WikiLeaks and Haiti Liberté. So the NGO model is complete. It's the reformist liberal hand of imperialism.
Well, that's one misperception you'll get, is a lot of times, people that are more working class and maybe taken in by some of the Trump demagogy will say things like, oh, why does America give away all our money to countries like Haiti? Well, we're not really helping the people of Haiti. This is giving it away to the CIA. This is giving it away to this NGO apparatus that is there to keep these countries poor, to manipulate their political process, to fund their own bureaucracies, et cetera. And the Red Cross is a great example of that. This NGO apparatus, USAID. It's not about helping these people and these countries. It's about keeping an imperialist and colonial relationship intact. And I think that point needs to be really, really made, and hit home, because a lot of this kind of America first libertarian rhetoric doesn't quite understand that. It really does think that the United States is just going around the world, writing people checks out of the goodness of its heart. And that's a big misperception, I think. Wouldn't you say?
I remember being in high school and having these debates with the most conservative students in my high school. And of course, the teachers, whose side were the teachers on? The teachers were always on the side of them. And they would present it as, oh my God, the United States is the benefactor of Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico and Mexico. And I was just like, oh my goodness. So this war of ideas, you described it real well. As if the U.S. was going around the world just benevolently tossing out money here and money there. So post-2010, it's a natural human impulse, American impulse. You want to help people. You see people buried under rubble. You see people affected by this or that hurricane in Central America or Haiti. But the true hurricanes, the true earthquakes are not these natural disasters. It is the colonial earthquake, the colonial hurricanes that have been impacting Central America, impacting Haiti. And anytime that people try to break away from the neoliberal, the neocolonial model, what do they do to Nicaragua? Why is there an all-out war on Nicaragua? The civil war in Nicaragua was anything but a civil war in 2018. It was internationalized civil war, just like what they've done to Syria. So I think that's our job as popular educators. That's what the Haitians are doing. Some people ask me, well, what about your safety and the bullets flying? And that was a very true reality. But when I was in the popular working class strongholds, in the anti-imperialist enclaves, in the hood, in the neighborhoods, I was the safest human being in the world. And across those neighborhoods, in the alleyways, they say corridoio, they have all this spray paint, all this people's art. You see beautiful posters of the Cacos and Chamay Peralt and Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines. So in many ways, I was the safest human being on earth until I had to leave the Haitian people's strongholds. It's when you crisscross through the city. Of course, the Haitian leadership knew where to bring me and where not to bring me. But if you get caught up in the wrong neighborhood that's controlled by these gangs, these paramilitaries, forces connected to the government, there's a great book by Jeb Sprague, if people want to do more research on this in recent history, Paramilitarism and the Assault on Democracy in Haiti. So yeah, in the battle of ideas, Caleb, to challenge the narrative that you just spoke on, that somehow the U.S. government is selflessly going around the world trying to help people trapped in China and trapped in Vietnam. People are watching too many Hollywood movies.
Yeah. Well, it's also worth pointing out that, a lot of times you'll get people who will say, well, why don't the people of Haiti, get their shit together? And then, why don't they fix things? And then you have to point out that, Haiti did have this president called Aristide, who was trying to raise people out of poverty, who was a socialist, who was building infrastructure, who was bringing in Cuban doctors and doing good work. And the USA called him a dictator and overthrew him. And even though he was popularly elected. And it's weird because now there's a dictatorship. There's this austerity regime that's been imposed on the Haitian people, and U.S. media says nothing about it. But when Aristide was there doing good work, we heard nothing but Aristide's a dictator, and ultimately, the U.S. military was sent in to remove him. And it shows that, you're a dictator when you stand up to Wall Street. And this guy in Haiti, he gets to give, you said he gave that long presentation to the UN with the internet going out. The U.S. media is not calling him out for what he is. And it shows the hypocrisy. It's only dictatorship when they lose. When they win, it's democracy. Just like Antony Blinken, he uses the phrase open international system. When Wall Street rules, it's just open, right? But if they start to lose, then suddenly it's not open anymore. It's just like de facto Western capitalist imperialism should rule, and that's the way the narrative is.
Yeah, this whole thing about the international community. What community? Who's international? Because the U.S. and their junior imperialist partners in France and England and Japan, because they support a project, the exhausted Juan Guaido sellout project, the selling off of Venezuela's resources. That's the international community. That's a global cabal. That's a global mafia. So the euphemisms that they used in the battle of ideas are very powerful. And so many of our people who are really good people, good Americans across this country, they haven't been exposed. And it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to confront that, wait a minute, my whole life from kindergarten and the Pledge of Allegiance and going to church, I was told that my country is the greatest country in the world, when in fact, the reality is not that the U.S. is the greatest country in the world, that this system is the greatest exploiter that the world has ever known. And what is exploitation? What does imperialism produce? It produces migration, not voluntary immigration. It produces people forced out of their country. And then you want to build walls. Right now, last week, the Dominican government, shame on them, Luis Abinader, the dictator or neoliberal puppeteer, I refuse to call him a president, but he's talking about building a 250-mile wall on the Dominican border. That's the last thing the Dominican people or the Haitian people need. And that harkens back to the 1937 massacre that Trujillo carried out against the Haitian people around Dajabon on the border. To this day, the amount of Haitians and dark-skinned Dominicans and what they call rayados, or mixed people, because borders are porous. Like I was last year, I actually found myself in Nuevo Laredo on the Mexican-American border, and all these, white people, as we're socially labeled, were so fluent in Spanish, and I just wanted to give them hugs. I was like, yo, but that's where they grew up. Of course, they're gonna be Spanish. That's what you speak there, right? Because of the particular history of these border regions. So it was interesting for me to find like your everyday Republican type dude, and boom, he was as bilingual as could be. And I was just like, this is amazing. But yeah, people should study Aristide. This is one of the best social histories for an English-speaking audience. Dr. Paul Farmer. I would have differences with him politically now with the aid industry and the massive NGO complex, but nonetheless, this book does a real good job. The uses of Haiti. And it shows you how Aristide was this incredible hope. Aristide was the Bolivarian Revolution before 1998. Aristide, they said that he was a mystique, meaning that he was a cat with 9 lives, that he had some majestic powers because every time they tried to kill him, he somehow survived. He used to have the liberation theology masses, and his masses were fire, fire, fire. He would point out the hypocrisy of imperialism, and he would call out, because in Haiti, the way Port-au-Prince is built, you have to go up into the hills to see where the rich are, in Pétionville, in Belleville, and you have these mansions and these palaces and these castles and 50 servants here and 50 private security guards here. It's wealth, you know, unparalleled wealth. So to say Haiti is poor is ridiculous. People should study and look at who the Haitian ruling class is. They are extremely white and light-skinned. So you see how racial capitalism plays out. And Aristide dared to, as a priest, as a people's priest, liberation theologian, and then twice elected president, a Bolivarian before the Bolivarian Revolution happened, he called all them out and he said, "Oh, whoa, you're getting too cob up there. They've monopolized our wealth." And they tried to kill him so many times. He still won the presidency in 1991. I was in Haiti in 2004 when Lavalas again won. And what happened both times? U.S. engineered, U.S. sponsored, international community sponsored coups against Aristide. So the metaphor is a bully on the playground. If you go to the playground and you get bullied every day, you're not going to blame the bullied kid. You're going to say the kid has to learn new tools to defend himself and keep fighting back. You can't let the bully run the playground. So that's Haitian history. That's the correct metaphor. Not that there's no hope for Haiti, but U.S., UN, OAS, hands off Haiti.
Now, one thing that I've heard about, and this is kind of a trend around the world, and it follows kind of what you were describing about the shadow state and the gangs that kidnap people and kind of enforce the austerity regime and block the protests. You know, I've heard from people who visit the Dominican Republic that as austerity and cutbacks and the economic crisis hits there are a lot of working class people who are like frustrated, and they'll say, "Oh, if only Trujillo was here, you know, that US-backed dictator," right? Or you'll get people in Haiti who will say, "Oh, things are so bad. If only the Duvaliers were back in power." And that there was a contrast. It seemed like during the early Cold War, the United States would prop up these kind of Bonapartist dictators, and they did allow some level of economic development. And that, you know, with the rise of Pinochet and neoliberalism in the 80s and 90s, now there's this model where you have a weak government that just kind of presides over you know, economic cutbacks, and that confusedly sometimes in these countries you'll get nostalgia for like the Cold War strongmen who at least presided over some level of social stability and economic development, as opposed to now the model is just demolition and rule of gangs and such. Do you see that transition and that confusion?
Oh, I heard that line. I lived in the Dominican Republic for many years. I've been back and forth. My family is Dominican. My son is Dominican. I hear that Trujillo line all the time. It drives me insane, but it's desmemorización. It's the lack of historical memory or the theft of historical memory, because the same people who control the airwaves also control our history and our textbooks. So when you repeat a lie 1,000 times, it becomes the truth. I actually did a special on Dominican independence. I put the word independence in quotes for a reason, because the Dominican Republic is a neo-colony by every definition, diplomatically, militarily, politically, economically. I interviewed an incredible Dominican economist, a Marxist economist. It's on YouTube at Anticonquista. His name is Cesar Cencion Villalona. It's in Spanish, but YouTube gives you the auto translate. You'll get like 85%. It's not flawless, but it is, because that was a big part of my work in Haiti, trying to translate everything, and it's extremely time consuming. So they've monopolized history. History is told by the victor. We should go deeper and deeper into what Trujillo meant for Dominicans economically. It was a pre-capitalist economy. Then you have the U.S. occupation, and they monopolize land and resources. It becomes a sugar monocrop economy. I mean, Trujillo almost becomes synonymous with the bourgeoisie because he's such a megalomaniac. He introduces capitalism, not for the Dominican people, he introduces capitalism for himself and a small group of cronies. And I want to actually use this Dominican historical analogy to talk about Haiti because it's ultimately the CIA and U.S. intelligence. And people can go back and look at this, the documentation and stuff. U.S. imperialism saw the Cuban Revolution. The Dominican Republic was going to be another Cuba in the Caribbean, some type of social democracy, socialism, communism, somewhere in that progressive territory. 42,000 U.S. troops invade in 1965 to overthrow the unfinished Dominican Revolution. But before that, what did U.S. intelligence, what did the Pentagon chiefs do? They assassinated Trujillo. And the documentation is there. There's conversations with General Imbert and others. But like Walter Rodney said, Anti-Conquista just did a tribute to Walter Rodney that people can check out as well. Walter Rodney talked about how colonialism is a one-armed bandit. So it gives the dictators as it takes. And just as easily as imperialism gave Trujillo, they withdrew Trujillo because imperialism can spin on a dime. And if Trujillo, and that's what they did with Trump. The ruling class, they almost got 4 more years of Trump, but the ruling class, whether it was through Twitter and the censorship, or whether it was, remember those economic deals, New York City will no longer do deals with Donald Trump. Where were you the past 4 years? Where were you the past 40 years? Was he somehow less racist and less xenophobic, 10 years ago? Less of a sexist? But my prediction with the Haitian situation is that Joe Biden, they're going to try to call Jovenel Moïse to some type of negotiating table. And what they might do then is pivot towards some type of more liberal, quote unquote, liberal candidate, one of these judges who was deposed, or one of these high profile lawyers. The leading candidate for the opposition, not the people's opposition, but the more liberal reformist is Moïse Jean-Charles, who has a long history of political opportunism. He kind of flirted with the Venezuelan revolution, but he has no track record with the people. So that's what the U.S. is going to do. That's why there's an embassy there. And they're calculating things. They have the best Haiti watchers and translators and political scientists working for them, and journalists. Long history, a relationship between the CIA and journalists. They have their own people doing this work. And if Jovenel Moïse is going down in the 11th round and they can't get to that 12th round or 15th round, suddenly they're going to champion one of these other bourgeois candidates, and they're going to try to give the Haitian people, give them something so that people can feel like, well, we marched for months and years, and finally we have a new face. But it's just a Biden instead of a Trump. It's an Obama instead of Bush, but the system is the same.
Great. Well, thank you for this very important update. People should know what's happening in Haiti. It's not an accident that our media is covering this up. Danny, you are always full of amazing insights. You're traveling all over the world, seeing close up the struggles of the people against imperialism and capitalism and for justice. So thank you very much for this important update. Very, very good. Thank you.
Thank you.